Greetings, all of you lovers of lore and legend. Christ is risen, he truly is risen. And we greet you whether you are a student, teacher, parent, teller of tales, moor wanderer, or hall dweller.
The Great Tales is a podcast about myths and legends from both inside and outside of the Christian tradition, and we come to you live twice a month to talk about these great stories that Christians have been reading and passing on for centuries, and sometimes even longer than that.
Yeah, last time we told the story of Orpheus, a bard so skilled that he was able to charm the Lord of Death himself.
And today, we are going to welcome one of the most skilled bards and storytellers that I've ever met. I don't know for sure that Dr. Martin Shaw has ever charmed Hades himself with a song. And yet I would not put it past him. Dr. Martin Shaw is with us today. He is a storyteller, a mythologist. He's the author of many books, including Smokehole, Courting the Wild Twin, Cinderbiter, which is a book of Celtic Poems, as well as his wonderful and heartbreaking book, Bardskull, which he says is not the one that you should start with, but that's terrible advice. Definitely start with it. Break your heart. No, it's one of my favorite books. He's also the host of Jawbone, which is a new podcast and YouTube channel dedicated to old stories and their place in the modern world. And he's done a lot of work over the years, sort of inviting readers and listeners into the wild edges of myth and memory. And the crazy thing about doing this is that sometimes, there are certain people who hold the door open, I think. And but then eventually you find that you have to go inside yourself. And so Dr. Martin Shaw converted to Christianity and then became an Orthodox Christian a number of years ago now. What is it? Maybe 3-4 years? Something like that. And since then, he's been encouraging us to seek what he calls the Mossy face of Christ, which is one of my favorite phrases I've ever heard within all of these old tales. So, Martin, welcome to the Great Tales podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. And earlier, I gave Martin a call beforehand to work out some technical issues. And I said, "Hello, Martin, Christ has risen." And Martin, you said to me, what?
I said, yes, he is risen indeed, and he's out and about.
That, folks, that's it. That's the canonical way. That's how we answer that from now on this podcast. I love that so much.
I have a question to start out with. So you speak about the mossy face of Christ. I want to understand exactly what you mean by that. I mean, do you think that the green man, that image in architecture is some version of that? Or, I mean, I see Richard like covering his mouth while he's chortling.
Because
obviously I've said some stupid thing.
No, it's not a stupid thing. It's because there's a story about this.
Okay. Because I want to understand exactly what that's supposed to mean.
Well, I think a phrase as poetic as the mossy face of Christ is not to be stretched on the rack of too much interpretation. You either, you kind of know or you don't know. You have an instinctive feeling for it. I suppose the mossy face of Christ for me comes from an encounter that I had. I went on a vigil, believe it or not, for 101 days in a forest. And the last night of that vigil involved staying up all night in an old Celtic hill fort. And you have to be careful with language sometimes around really deep experience. You have to sort of circle around it. If you're too foursquare with it, if you're just hammering the hammer on the nail, the thing can almost fall apart in your hands. But I certainly, in the middle of the night, had an encounter with what I would call the mossy face of Christ. And I suppose as a storyteller and as a Christian, I could think of 100 burning bush type examples of what it feels like to have an encounter with the gospel of a cormorant or the gospel of a river or the gospel of a salmon. In other words, God's original church, the earth, this thing that he created and thought was very good. So I suppose it's something in that direction. It quite honestly, between you gentlemen, it's something that it's a phrase that just came out of me and I never gave it another thought, but it's turned out to have quite a lot of traction. It has a cult following. So probably the mossy face of Christ there, in its slight open-endedness, there's something creative in it. So I won't be too didactic about what it means, but no doubt it'll be threaded through most of what we have to say over the next hour or two.
Yeah, I mean, it's so evocative, and I mean, the fact that it's not just like a bearded face, right? But mossy, suggesting this kind of weathered, lying there for a long time, out in the elements. I don't know. I mean, like there's as you said, it's a poetic phrase, and so one of the things that occurs to me is it has to do with Christ as the creator, but actually also in his creation. You know, not just...
That's it. Yeah. Before Abraham, I am. And so I'm thinking about Paleozoic Christ, Paleolithic Christ. I'm thinking about Christ before cities. I have no idea what that could be, but I have a sense of the ancientness of it. The reason that I'm an Orthodox Christian and not a Catholic or anything else is because somewhere in my first experience of divine liturgy, it was as if in the second hour, a doorway opened. Again, these are things that are difficult to talk about. Poetry is almost the only resource we have, but a door opened that took me very briefly into a sense of a God, of a Christ that was immeasurably ancient. The only phrase I can use is the ancient good. And that was a wonderful experience. And to put it mildly, it keeps you coming back. Keeps you coming back.
I mean, there is something particularly... I was going to say, there is something particularly about the divine liturgy that I think is kind of mossy in a way. I mean, it's got this sort of... You know, it's been collecting stuff for a long time. It's not completely straightforward. Even Orthodox architecture and our whole aesthetic, as it were, is very kind of cluttered and moldered.
And the fun thing is that we start to become part of the moss ourselves. You know, my teacher, Father Silvio Bunta, who recently had surgery, so pray for him. He is a Romanian priest, and he said, the terrible news is that I am also part of Holy Tradition, and so are you. So Martin, you said something about this idea of Christ in all of these places, and the way that only poetry can truly capture this. And so I thought, if it wouldn't be too cheeky, that I would offer, could I read you a poem? Now, you both know this poem quite well, I'm sure. But it is the one that, as soon as I heard you say that phrase the first time, the mossy face of Christ, it is the one that stuck with me. This is, it's the poem I thought of immediately when I heard you say that.
This is not in the script, so I have no idea about what Richard's about to do.
We're just yeah. So this is As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins, which you're both quite familiar with, I'm sure. But it goes like this: As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bells, bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself, it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Anyway, that's the poem I always sort of think of.
Yeah,
I mean, you use that phrase.
Yeah, amen, amen, amen. I was in a Romanian church in the west of Ireland recently with Paul van der Clay and Paul Kingsnorth. And, it was in the loveliest sense of the word, it was business as usual. I was familiar with it. And then about halfway through, a door suddenly opened, a literal door. And flooding through the door came the sound of seagulls. and the sound actually of the Atlantic Ocean. And when you get to Galway, there's not much till you get to Turtle Island. There's not much till you get to America. And I often find that the divine interventions in the liturgy are often, sometimes they're connected to the more obvious ceremonial element, but sometimes it's a seagull or it's a child that's playing with a picture in that second hour when you're kind of slightly rocking back and forward and you're tired. So I love profoundly in the Orthodox tradition this sense of intense formality and mild anarchy kind of bumping into each other all the time. It's so human. It's so warming to my soul to be around all of it going on at the same time. And as somebody said to me, they said, look, be careful. You just be careful going to divine liturgy. You be careful with that stuff. Because if you go more than 5 times, you'll never stop. And they were right.
That's completely fair. I generally speaking, as a catechist, I know that once somebody has come 4 or 5 times, they're probably, 90% of the time they're going to make it all the way.
One of the things that occurs to me is that, talking about seagulls, although I have to say, Dr. Shaw, when you said something about, not much, and then there's America, I thought, wow, the Atlantic Ocean, not much. Not much. But no, it occurs to me that in our modern age where buildings can be so easily kind of hermetically sealed and controlled, for temperature and all of that, I think that most of our forefathers would have had a much more permeable church in terms of sounds and wind and temperature and all of that. And I've read also that even I have a lot of Germanic blood. My blood is pretty northern, so the idea of being on time is very baked into me. But I've talked to liturgical scholars, not just those who focus on texts, but those who focus on, okay, what do we know about how people actually interacted with services? And the idea of showing up before it begins and then leaving after it's over is kind of a modern expectation in some ways. Not that I'm saying that people should do any different, but yes, this kind of permeability of the liturgy to the world writ large is it's very interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, that works also with the tradition of storytelling. We now have these books that have these little episodic chapters of story, but they were originally usually taken out of much bigger, more gregarious traditions that everybody understood. So one of the reasons we're often so baffled when we're reading a little folk tale is because we've taken a little bit of a meal that was a much longer, more expansive meal that people drifted in and out of, fell asleep, woke up, came back the next week. The story was told again. What we have in modern books, for example, if we're thinking about fairy tales, is shorthand. It's shorthand. And it's tragic when storytellers learn shorthand and think that is the finished poetic discourse with that bit of work. I know you'll be familiar with this. It's the difference between the matter of the story and the sense of the story. The matter is the bones, but the sense is that odd, irascible genius that a particular teller brings to it. I think, mercifully, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about this, actually, see what you think. One of the things that's so wonderful about fairy tales is they're not chapter and verse. They die if they're chapter and verse. That's not their function. And the interesting thing for me now, having made this move as a storyteller, as a Seanchai in the wider sense, into the business of beginning to tell stories from the Old Testament, for example, which I love and have found far more meat on the bone than I ever possibly could have remembered as a child. But of course, that chapter and verse quality that gives them their pathos, that gives them their sense of scripture, I suppose, that can sit uneasily when you're trying to tell it like a story. You know, nobody. I don't want to hear the beginning. I like, you know, in the beginning was the word. I don't need to hear it in a more casual fashion.
Yep.
Because something in me straightens up when the words arrive in that manner. You know, I go to a church where we don't read, we chant, you know, we chant. And so there's that sense of something, it's like water moving over a pebble for thousands of years, rather than hearing the reader digging into tons of personality at that moment, which of course you can imagine for a storyteller is, I like that. I warm to it. But I wondered what you felt about how do you approach telling stories from scripture as opposed to telling, say, you know, Beowulf or a fairy tale?
It's a great question, and this is one I've been thinking about a lot lately because I'm working on a book which is a series of essentially retellings, largely of saints' lives. But I'm planning, and it's saints having to do with dragons is actually the thing that binds it all together. But the first major story I'm planning to tell is the story of Jonah, and I've been working on, okay, how do I pay this story its due in terms of the fact that this is scripture I'm talking about here. This is not just, I don't want to use the word just, but this is not the more flexible, more fulsome, you know, kind of tradition that is a lot of other storytelling. But I mean, I think one of the things that we see, though, historically, for instance, there's the whole tradition, and this is largely regarded as a Jewish tradition, but it's also it's a Second Temple Jewish period tradition. It's a Christian tradition as well, of what, at least what in Jewish tradition they call midrash, where they take the biblical, for those who don't know, take the biblical story and there's kind of gaps in it, maybe, right. Or at least the storyteller sees a gap and writes something new into it, not suggesting, okay, this is the real story, I'm changing the story, but rather, here's a way for me to tell this story that can be applicable to my listeners right now. And so, like, one of the things that I'm thinking about doing, I mean, maybe tell me if this is crazy. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but since you asked the question, is you know, many times in Northern European stories where the hero confronts a dragon, there's a whole conversation that happens between the hero and the dragon. Sometimes after the hero has stuck his sword into it, there's a whole conversation as the thing is bleeding out. And I've thought about essentially taking this kind of midrashic approach to the story. And when Jonah meets the sea monster, which there are some interpretations of this to suggest that this is Leviathan himself, the great underwater dragon, is having a conversation between Jonah and Leviathan in such a way that, God willing, honors the biblical traditions about both of these figures. I haven't actually begun that part of the text yet, so I don't know if I'm just crazy or what.
So I wanted to say something. I was going to mention the Midrashim as well. By the way, I just got a book in the mail that is a collection of Midrashim on Jonah, so I'll let you know if there's anything interesting in there. Yeah.
What? You're holding out on me, Richard. Come on.
Listen, I read a lot of things, but yeah, I'll let you know if there's anything interesting in there. But the part of the sort of the trick with doing the Midrash seems to be that you cannot alter what is there. So if something is already there in the scripture, you cannot change it. So the thing that you were looking for then is sort of, what are the gaps that, if we filled them in, would make the story cohere, or would reveal sort of like hidden motivations in the story? Or one of my favorite, midrashes, if you want to think of it in that way, is the Book of Jubilees, which is a book I've read and studied a lot. And it is basically an extended midrash, sometimes just called the Lesser Genesis, because it's just an extended midrash on the Book of Genesis. Yeah. And so you get into certain things in there, and the question of, so to give an example, Potiphar, there's a guy named Potiphar and his wife, right? So Potiphar imprisons Joseph after Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce Joseph. Right. And then later on, once Joseph has his rise, he has his death, and then he has his resurrection. So once he has his rise, he marries a woman who is the daughter of somebody named Potiphar the priest. So you have these two different Potiphars.
Yeah.
In Joseph's story. So
it's a common Egyptian name.
Sure, but I mean, if you look in the text, it's the natural question that you should ask when you're just reading Genesis is, are these the same person? And so there are a lot of midrashes around Joseph and Asenath, which we'll probably talk about later on in the show, that basically kind of sort of try to tease these different things out. And so I think that's the sort of question. I know that's what I would say, Martin, is when you're reading, ask the question that because there are questions that the scriptures seem to sort of beg or suggest, that it would not be wrong to ask this, but the answer isn't provided here. And very often, the answer is somewhere else in the tradition.
Yeah.
So
I had the privilege recently of telling the story of Jacob and Esau with Rowan Williams, so our ex-Archbishop of Canterbury. And Rowan, who was teaching with me, actually, and he came to teach on Taliesin, the Welsh bard. He didn't come to teach gospel. He came to talk about Taliesin, and he was incantatory in his brilliance at doing that. But I also, obviously, once you've got a man of that kind of pathos in the room, you're going to say, listen, I'm going to have a crack at Jacob and Esau. Will you come along? And he was like, try and stop me. And so he was in. And, you take a deep breath when you've got a man that held the Anglican Church together for a decade under some of its most extreme duress. You are briefly self-conscious about what you're about to do to this wonderful story, because I can only proceed. I can only imagine in public. But in the storytelling tradition, Richard, and it's similar to what you've described, the tradition really, as stories get handed down through families and cultures, are not that you can change anything, but a story is like a meal. It's like a recipe. And if you discover smoked paprika, you can put a bit of smoked paprika in with the chicken, So you figure out the pressure points in the story that are not going to cause absolute psychic collapse, but just somehow sift it to consciousness in the times that we're in. In oral culture, it was a collective decision to keep remembering something. You had to decide to keep remembering something. We didn't have finite modes of retention around us like we do, or infinite modes of retention. It was finite. So a story, a storehouse, as a thing collecting with, secrets and information about how to live, very important. But that's the way I realized I was going to have to do it. You have to really know the story well, I think, in a chapter and verse fashion. Be careful not to play it for laughs, for goodness sake. Because if you have a comedic streak in you, which I would imagine all three of us probably do once we're, up and running, it doesn't always land well if you're kind of winking at the audience when you're talking about Jacob in the underworld of Egypt. But on the notion of midrash, which I also was going to bring up, you gents, I'm sure, are familiar with that old it's kind of folk tale, really, about Jesus and the stoning of the woman, and the notion that the thing he's drawing in the dust is an audit of the sins of everybody that's asking the questions. And they peer over his shoulder, and like a kind of scrying bowl, they gaze into their own detritus. Well, I think once you've told the story, it's quite legitimate to bring that up just as a sort of form of imagining, because for me, that gives me a lot to think about. That's the way I found it, is don't start crowbarring those things into the story themselves, but there should be space around in which we all understand the climate we're in and we do it. But I like your original idea with Jonah. I think that sounds great. You should do it. Proceed.
Thank you. All right, I'll take that as a blessing.
Good.
I was going to say, one of the things that you see in the church fathers, when they're doing scriptural interpretation, which, I mean, most patristic writings, that's what it is scriptural interpretation, is they will tell you what's in the scripture, and then they'll say, and if there's a question like, what did Jesus write, for instance, in the sand, they may say something then some say this, and I've also heard it said that this, and they'll introduce these things as a mode of interpretation.
Right.
Right. It's not understood to be altering the story, but as a way of interpreting the story. And the purpose, of course, is application. That this is for this time and place for these people who are listening to me, and it's actually paying honor to the scriptures by doing that. It's a way to help bring people in, so that there can be this. There's the core in the middle, and then there's these relative bits around the edges. And often you need to connect the relative bits so that you can actually see what's in the core, because otherwise, the sharpness of it, the power of Scripture might be too much for you. I think in some ways you might not be able to access it unless you have some of this other kind of it's the same reason. Like in the very first episode of this show, we analyzed and discussed St. Basil's text on how to read pagan literature. And he says in there that you need to master that before he's going to let you read the Bible, which that's a very extreme. It's an extreme thing to say.
You have to read Homer before you're allowed to read the Bible.
Right. I mean, I would not, put that in catechism now, but the principle perhaps that he's talking about is a sense of literacy, and maybe that's what this midrashic kind of thing helps people have. If you understand stories, then when you come to the story, the great story, then you might be able to receive it better. I'm just sort of working through some of this stuff out loud right now, actually.
Yeah. So, I think that also part of what maybe St. Basil is saying, that like if you don't know how to read poetry and to read things poetically. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this in our world today. People don't know how to read poetry. They don't know how to think poetically. And then they read the scriptures and it breaks them in some way. Maybe it breaks them because they can't bear it. Maybe it breaks them because they try to like take everything literally and apply it to everybody else's lives around them and all these different things. But if you don't have the ability to sort of read poetry, to put yourself, in the people in the story. I mean, this is my big challenge, to you, Father Andrew, when we were reading Homer, is that, to read Homer well, you have to get to a point where you love everyone in the Iliad, even though they're all terrible people. You have to love them.
I'm still working.
Still working. Yeah, it's okay. But so yeah, I think that's also kind of part of it. So, well, Martin, how are you feeling? Do you want to tell us a story?
Yeah, I will. I think what I'll do to lead into the story, I'm interested in what we're talking about, and I'll situate for a second that quite what a storyteller is in the way that I would understand it. And the way, especially if we have Orthodox folk, listening in or watching today, one of the figures you could probably identify with the kind of character I'm about to suggest, you would have come across in Russia and Siberia in the mid-19th century. The pilgrims, the wanderers, the Straniks, the people that went from place to place, because I come out of a tradition that would be called a Shanachie. Now, Shanachie is not necessarily, it doesn't have a religious inflection on it exactly, but it is what is known, you're what they call a cultural historian of a place. So you tell the stories of a very particular place. You understand the gossip of the hedgerows in your area. And a Shanachie is not really a bard. That's a useful distinction to make. I suffer the embarrassment, actually, in a way, of people saying to me, "Oh, you're a bard, you're a this, you're a that." A bard is a very highfalutin position. Actually, if you were in Irish culture, a bard is not what you want to be. What you want to be is something called an olav. An olav is the chief bard. But bards became creatures of court. They ended up praising the landowner, not the land. And whilst we do have extraordinary examples of bardic literature in full flow, and I love the word, but what we think of as a bard in 2025 is not at all what a bard was 1,000 years ago. Not at all. It's different. That becomes, if you became a bard in Ireland 1,000 years ago, the first thing they would do is rob you of regional diction. They'd get rid of all the twists and turns in your language that meant you were a Kerry man, not a Connemara man, or from, you know, any other district, because what they wanted, because they were under so much sort of pressure in a way from European culture, they wanted a unified voice. And unified voices often get very, very by rote quite quickly. So the bardic tradition, whilst it has extraordinary examples in it that are very fulsome and original, a lot of it becomes really long eulogies with a kind of half a foot in the Bronze Age actually behind them. As soon as you've got poems about cattle, you're in the Bronze Age, just so you know. That's what that's about. And as soon as you've got stories about cattle, and you're dealing with the upper class, you're dealing with the aristocracy, and that's the bardic tradition. The Seanchai tradition is much, much closer to the ground. It's much humbler. It carries the voltage of the folk tradition, but a Seanchai would be somebody that would wander from settlement to settlement. They often didn't have much money. They may be sleeping in the barn that night, but everybody knew who they were. And they had an odd, venerated position where they would come in, they'd be warmed, they'd sit by the fire, they'd get a glass of whiskey, they'd get a meal, and word would go out through the neighborhood that the Seanchai had arrived. And by sheer wit, a Seanchai should be able to give you a secret history of the world through stories. That's what they should do. Now, a bard, it's all about reciting. Have you recited 60,000 memorized words? It's more Homeric. The Seanchai is somebody that wanders out loud in a room. They have a kind of an imagination that can take you back into that deep time, prehistoric state, and almost, you know, in a Genesis-like manner, bring you up to the present day. Now, what's so wonderful about that is that takes a really long time. So the Seanchai gets fed and watered for months, if they're good. And then their reputation is so set, they proceed to the next village, and it happens again, and it happens again. But the Seanchai always insist they've never told the story before, because in a way they haven't ever told the story before, because it's not fecking memorized. It's an eruption, and it's an exfoliation. It's you'll remember this phrase. The great Irish hero Fionn McCool. They say to Finn, "What do you love most? Is it the belling of the stag? Is it a storm? Is it the sigh of a contented woman? What do you love most?" And he says, "What I love most is the music of what happens. What I love most is the music of what is." Now, Seanchai loves the music of what happens, which means they are these slightly disruptive figures that you can't really draw in one line because you never quite know. They're medicinal in a way, a Seanchai. They're medicinal. They come into a room, they take a quick diagnosis, and then they start to tell stories that go to whatever the healing condition is that needs to arrive that night. One of the first storytellers I ever met was a Lakota Sioux medicine man called Wallace Black Elk. And I remember I haven't thought about this for years, but Wallace said to me, he said, you know, if somebody's got a bad kidney, there'll be myths and folk tales to be told to the kidney, or to be told to the liver, or the condition of the heart. Our body is designed medicinally to receive nutrients from certain stories at certain times. We can feel how wise this is instantaneously. We're like, well, of course, what a brilliant idea. You almost place the story on where, you know, what ails you. Think of the Grail. What ails you? So Seanchai are these strange, mysterious wanderers, really, whose home is the stories that they dwell in. And they are charismatic, irascible, mysterious, and mostly disappeared, mostly gone. There's a few, but most of them are gone. And when I would have been, I grew up in a kind of a house of stories. I grew up in a house without a phone or a car or any of that. And my but I grew up in a very Christian house. My father is a preacher, my brother is a pastor, my sister is a Catholic. So language, and actually the beauty of a sermon well delivered and well crafted, you know, that was nutrition as we were growing up. We loved those stories. One of my earliest memories is the sound of rudimentary Greek and rudimentary Hebrew coming through the door. So my dad was in the bath practicing these ancient languages while he was having his bath. But then on the way home from church, we'd walk through a forest. And so I'd hear a story, a Grimm story. And all of that, that's the kind of environment and the world that I grew up in. So when I haven't talked much about this, I don't think. When I was in my 20s, I took myself away for 4 years and just lived in a tent on the side of a succession of English hills to, in my own befuddled and rather rudimentary way, have a kind of Shanachie apprenticeship, both to story and to land, the mythology of a landscape, the landscape of a mythology. So that may or may not be useful to us, but I need to kind of emphasize that in Celtic culture, you wouldn't be talking about the meaning of stories if you weren't telling the stories as well. They are utterly simpatico. You otherwise it's very stimulating theory, but what you want is the encounter. So on that note, I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story that is very new to me, and it's a fairy tale. And it involves one of our, well, I won't say anything. I'll just do it. I've only told it 3 times. It's about luck. Once upon a time, there was a boy that was born to parents that were very poor. Now, the boy was born and he had a cold over his head when he was born, which meant in the village all sorts of prophetic things. It meant he was going to be a child of luck. Wherever he went through his life, luck would walk with him. Now, watching the birth was an old woman, and she came up with a prophecy. She got very excited and she said, not only will he be lucky, on his 14th birthday, he will marry the daughter of the king. Now, it happens that the king is wandering through the settlement in disguise because he realizes he can only get the gossip of places when he's in disguise. If he turns up looking like Elijah on his chariot, he's not going to get anything out of anybody. So he comes in a bit like Odin, actually, like low key, low. And he hears that this young scrap of a kid is going to marry his daughter on the 14th birthday. So he goes to the parents and he says, well, you have given birth to a lucky child and the luck begins now. I will give you 9 gold coins for your lucky kid. Well, 9 gold coins is it's a life-changing amount of money to that family, and they have many other starving children around them. So the parents go in a huddle, and astonishing as it sounds, they say, okay, give us the cash, give us the gold, and you can have the lucky child. Because if he's going to be lucky, he'll be lucky with the king. Well, the king, I'm afraid, wanders only 100 yards from the village, and he finds a box. He puts the baby in a box, and he chucks him in the river. I wish I could tell you that he threw the baby in the water in a kind of rather like Moses or rather like Taliesin. We're hoping for a happy ending, but he wasn't. He hoped that little critter would sink. But he's a lucky child, isn't he? He's a lucky child. So he floats along on the green teeth of the river, and he very quickly comes into the rushes at the bottom of the garden of the miller. Now, of course, being a fairy tale, the miller and his wife discover the baby. And of course, they've never had a child and they've always wanted a child. And this is absolutely providential and sent from God. So for 14 years, this very happy world exists between the 3 of them until who should be wandering along on almost the 14th birthday of this very handsome lad, but the king, of course. Now, the king meets the miller and his wife. And he says, who's that lad out the back? I know you two had some sort of downstairs mix-up and you couldn't have children. Who's that? And he said, well, my lord, this is an accent where I come from. You wouldn't believe it. It ain't be natural, but there was a child and he was born and he came out of the river. He's in a little box. Someone wanted to drown him. But we've grown up and this lovely little lad, he's the bright pulse of our whole understanding. He's the sky boy of the dawn. Here he is. Well, the king, being a king, realizes instantaneously what has happened. And he thinks fast. So he says to them, he says, listen, your boy being as young as he is and as strong as he is, I can look at his long legs, he could take a letter to my wife, because I haven't seen my wife in ages. So he says, I'll write this letter for my wife. I'll give you some gold and send the boy off through the deep, dark forest to where on the other side, the castle is where my wife lives. It's a love note. It's a love note. We do this kind of thing. It keeps our romantic life going after all these years. So the lad is excited. He's got this quest. He's entering the world of the great feminine. He's bringing a letter to the queen. He doesn't know what's in the letter. Now, you will remember from your own childhoods, if you enter a deep, dark forest, the forest you go into and never come out, the one thing you absolutely, positively must not do is stray from the path. You remember this, don't you? Don't stray from the path. Well, of course, he's got his Walkman on. He's listening to Pearl Jam. He gets distracted. He wanders into the forest. And soon the lad is completely lost. Well, the night settles on him. He hears an owl hooting from a slippery, wet, black branch. And he's lost and he's frightened. Comes to a house. Well, it's not a house, it's a hut. Knocks on the door of the hut. The door opens. There's a woman there. A wonderfully shaped woman. Have you ever seen a statue called the Venus of Willendorf? Do you know what the Venus of Willendorf looks like? It's this enormous cave-filling, imminent, ancient female presence. Well, this is what this woman is like.
Yeah.
And she says, well, come on in, but you've got to eat quickly because my sons are coming and they're all robbers and they'll kill you. And he says, look, madam, I'm so tired. I'm so lost. I'm so frightened. I'm going to have to take my chance with your sons. He eats, he falls asleep. The lads turn up and they see the letter. I'm not going to lie. They were about to do something very wicked to the boy, but they read the letter. And the letter says this: my darling wife, kill immediately the boy that has brought you this letter. He's a very dangerous character. Well, these robbers are so chilled by the coldness of the king. They have a movement of the heart themselves. And they say, no, he's one of us. He's a man of the soil. We can't have him walk into this murderous situation. So they change the letter. Now, the one thing you have to know about the king's note is that he writes beautifully. He has particular ink. It's the ink of a pelican. It's pelican's blood. And he writes with the thumbnail of Dostoevsky, so it's a very particular, beautiful set of handwriting he does, the whole thing. Well, they can't mimic that. They're a bit more the Mossy end of it. So they kind of put a few thumbprints in. But the letter says this: my darling wife, I miss you very much. I met the perfect guy to marry our daughter Karen. He's standing in front of you. Marry them today. Don't wait for me to return. All is well. I love you, Antoinette. Love, Rodri. Moi, moi, moi. That's the new letter. So he turns up, and astonishingly, before he knows it, he has married, like the prophecy, like the old woman said, he's married the daughter of the king. Well, king comes home and he loses his stirrups. He says, this is absolutely positively not what I wanted to happen. But you're meant to be dead. You're not meant to be a sovereign. You're not meant to be my son. I'm going to send you out, and I'm going to send you out for something very specific. And if you can pull this off, possibly you could grow into quite what it means to be a king. And he says, well, what do you want me to do? And he says, I want you to go all the way to hell. I want you to go all the way to the devil. And I want you to bring me back 3 golden curls from the devil's head. So this, for me, is an astonishing bit of information. Who knew that the devil has this great leonine mane of hair? I always think of Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin. Who knew that down in hell, it's filled with guys that look like they're in Whitesnake. They've got this big hair down there. That's hell. Hades, it's like a rock club. It's like a rock club down there in hell. They're all listening to, yeah, it's just kind of making sense actually at the moment. So he goes off to collect 3 golden hairs from the devil's head. Now stay with me, boys. We're almost there. He comes to 2 towns. And at each town, there is a gatekeeper. And in Irish and Celtic myth, gatekeepers are terribly important, and Welsh for all sorts of reasons. And they say, we'll only let you through if you ask the devil what has happened to the fountain in the centre of our village that used to produce wine, and a very particular one, Chateau Neuf de Pape, absolutely gorgeous. What has happened to our de Pape? Ask the devil. That's the first village, goes through. Normally, by the way, I would tell this over 2 hours, so you're getting the short version. Gets to the next town. You shall not pass, says the gatekeeper, disguised as Gandalf. Let me in. All right, ask the devil this question. Ask the devil what has happened to our Yggdrasil, our world tree in the centre of the town. It used to produce these golden apples that we liked and flourished. We all loved them. And now it's just withered leaves. What's happened to our tree? What's happened to our golden apples? I'll ask him. Now, this is when the story, as fairy tales often do, they take a little twist into the Mediterranean. Little twist. We sort of move down into the Mediterranean because he comes to a river. And you and I, and we all know from our Greek myths, separating the Greek underworld from here, there is often a river. And sure enough, there's a ferryman. And the ferryman, frankly, is looking, as we say in England, cheesed off. He's jaded. He's like a really depressed version of Leonard Cohen, just sitting on the end of the boat. And the guy says, well, can I have a lift to hell? And he says, you can, but you've got to ask the devil this question. And he says, well, what is it? And he says, frankly, I can't remember how I got this job. I just can't remember. I've been doing this for so long. And the caliber of people I meet are appalling. Think about who I mean. I'm taking them all to hell. Nobody's lived a good life down here. What I want you to ask the devil is, how do I pass this job on to the next generation? You know, I feel that I've peaked. I've been here for at least 100,000 years. And he says, okay, let's get this straight. I've got to ask about the wine. I've got to ask about the tree. I've got to ask about getting the ferryman out of his job. 3 things. So he goes on. Now, the atmosphere completely changes. C.S. Lewis once said, the road to hell will not be signposted. But I can promise you, gentlemen, there is a distinct change of atmosphere at this point in the story. We are moving down into smoke and mist, and there's dark mountains and bats are swooping. Milky-eyed Tiresias is wandering around all confused. And he goes further and further down into Hades, further and further down into hell. And what he finds is this. The devil is not there. The devil's not there. There's a throne. The devil is clearly usually there, but today he's not there. And sitting in the throne, interestingly, is not the devil, but his grandmother, who, funnily enough, has that wonderful shape I described to you 5 minutes ago. She's a little bit like the woman in the cottage, actually, if you look at her from a certain perspective, Willendorfian. And she says, listen, you're not dead, I can tell this, and I can tell you're not a wicked lad. Why would you be down here? And he takes a chance. I mean, first of all, who knew the devil had a grandmother? I don't know where that's hidden. And he says to her, well, I'm down here because of the story. And the old woman says, oh, is it a love story? And he realizes her attention is entirely on him now. She thinks it's a love story. And he says, yes, it is. It's about how I've fallen in love with Karen the princess, and we have this great love. And he spins the story, so it sounds like Tristan and Isolde and Romeo and Juliet, and the bad king won't let them get married. And the grandmother gets really emotional herself, and she says, it was like this with me and Beelzebub in the old days. We were just devils with a dream. Devils with a dream. And no one would let us marry down here. And the more he lays the story on, the more rococo, the more baroque, the more sort of wafting with perfume it is. She gets really emotional, and she says, you know, man, I'm going to help you. You don't want to get in the way of my grandson. He's trouble. But come and sit in the folds of my skirt and I'll get you the 3 golden curls. And so, an hour later, up turns the devil. Now, the devil, as we have predicted, just this astonishing rock god hair. You know, I think most of the ferryman visits are it's just the boats are just full of hair product, just going back and forth to hell. And he comes in, and there's a particular thing that he does every night. He comes back stressed because the devil gets terribly stressed. And so he turns around and he sits kind of on his granny's knees, and she kind of massages his shoulders. And she says, why are you so upset? And he says, well, Mum, you know, he says, I can cope with all the plagues I have to deliver and the betrayals and the murders, but it's the Zoom calls, those frigging Zoom calls. It's going to be the end of me. And he says, you know, sometimes, Granny, I wonder, am I the good guy? I mean, am I the, she says, of course you're the good guy. Of course even the devil doesn't think he's the bad guy. Even the devil has some peculiar narrative that he's still hanging on to. Anyway, she relaxes him. She sings him songs. He falls asleep. And as soon as he's fallen asleep, she pulls one of the golden hairs and puts it in her pocket. He wakes up. Ah, what happened? And she says, I fell asleep too, and I had a dream. And the dream was that there is a village and it used to have golden apples on a tree and now it's all withered. And why would that be? And he says, oh, that is my work. That's my work. He said, actually, if the villagers were going to go down into the roots of the tree, they would find a mouse. And the mouse has been nibbling and nibbling and nibbling on the world tree. And in 48 hours' time, it will have nibbled it entirely and the world tree will collapse. And that'll be the end of that village. Funny you should mention. However, if they humanely removed that mouse, because we don't want to upset if there's any children listening, if the mouse was humanely removed, carefully and conscientiously and taken somewhere else, all would be well. And she goes, all right, okay. Go to sleep, my little devil boy. Go to sleep, my little devil boy. He goes to sleep, bah! Takes another hair. And he says, you woke me up again. She says, I had a nightmare. She says, I dreamt about a fountain filled with Chateauneuf de Pape that's been there since creation. What's happened to it? And he said, oh, yeah, that's my work as well. There is a very nasty little frog, toad, in fact, that I've wedged under a rock. And that has wronged the spring. It's wronged the fountain. But if you, again, just gently remove that toad and told it of its sins and put it out on a rock, out in the desert, let it get in touch with its desert father, toady self, come back, it would live, it all would be well. He said, okay, falls asleep again. Fall asleep, my little devil child. Bang, pulls the third hair. And it's the ferryman now, isn't it? It's the ferryman? Yeah. And she says, the ferryman can't remember how he got the job and how he gets out of the job. And he said, oh, it's very, very simple. All he has to do is the next person that comes down to the river, pass them the oar so they climb into the boat. The moment they grip the oar, it's their job now. It's their job now. Finally, he falls asleep. The old woman reaches into the folds of her skirt and she sees, peering out, is the lad. And she gives him, she said, did you hear the answers? He says, I did. Gives him the 3 strands of hair. He runs back, tells the ferryman, goes to the first town. They're so thrilled, they give him a donkey with 2 saddlebags of gold in. Goes to the next town. They're so thrilled to remove the mouse and the toad, can't remember which, and they got their Chateauneuf de Pape back, and they give him a donkey filled with gold. So finally, he returns to the king, not only with the 3 golden hairs from the devil's head, but all this wealth. And the king finally kind of, I don't know if there's someone you've known who you're not paying attention to, but they do something that's impressive. And suddenly, like the optic changes on them, you sort of tune them into vision. And he says, okay, this is spectacular. You really pulled this off. You and I could have a relationship, but tell me this about the gold. Where can I get more gold like this? And he says, oh, it's very simple. You've got to go down to this guy, the ferryman. He'll reach to you with his oar, grab the oar, get on the boat. And on the other side, of course, is more gold down there near hell than you could ever need. You'll be rich beyond your wildest dreams. So, of course, thrilled as he is, the king runs down, sees the ferryman waves at him, offers him the oar, the king grabs the oar, and as far as I know, to this day, to this very hour, to this very night, he is down there doing the difficult night shift back and forth to hell. Now, back at the castle, there was a wonderful, long, protracted and happy. The wedding itself lasted for years. Everybody you loved as a child came to this wedding. Musicians came to this wedding. There was feasting. It went on for days. I heard a rumor it took 7 men working 7 days just to stir the mustard at such a wedding as this. You know, they say that love is blind, but marriage is a great eye-opener. Marriage is a great eye-opener. But their eyes were opened in a beautiful way. And as far as I can tell, in that kingdom that is both inside us and outside us, they are all living in their own luck, and more importantly, their own grace, to this day, the end. That's the story. It's fun, isn't it?
Yes. You know, I have my 4th child was born entirely inside his call.
Wow.
And I've heard many stories, of course, that involve this kind of thing, you know, either on the head or whatever. But there is something about him. There is something about him. He's
one of my sisters was also born completely inside of her call, and she's definitely the luckiest one of us 8, that's for sure.
Really? So I'm going to Canada in a few days' time, which we should leave a link maybe for your listeners. If anybody's in Canada, I'm going to be on the west coast around Vancouver. I'm telling Parsifal for 4 days and 4 nights. Going to do a whole day on Gawain and the Green Knight, but I'm also doing an evening called the Tent of Seven Doors. We still have a few tickets for it, and this is one of the stories that I'm telling because I'm really interested in this notion of, what do you think luck is? Is luck grace? Is luck something that God apportions out? Is luck something we create from the way we perceive circumstance? What do we think luck is? So if I was to ask you two gentlemen, if you had taken your way back through that story now, is there a particular you find yourself coming back to?
There's 2 pieces that really strike me. The one that I think is probably the part that I haven't worked through how it works for me yet, maybe, is when the lad knowingly sends the king to go become the new ferryman of hell. I mean, he knows what's going to happen to him. And up to this point, everything that he's done has been very altruistic. But I mean, is this the judgment of God being enacted upon the king for his many sins? And obviously his last movement is towards greed. But I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to work through that one. The other piece is, of course, is that the idea of going and kind of hoodwinking the devil. But that's a wonderful classic trope in a lot of fairy tales. I know that, for instance, in Baltic fairy tales, the devil is not really the king of the underworld. He's this trickster that often the idea in the story is to trick him to get something out of him, you know, tricking the trickster. But yeah, it's that idea, especially of him sending the king off to his doom. That's kind of
for me, I love it. I mean, for me, that's the end of his any vestige. He would have been working with a very corrupt person forever, you know, forever. So for me, in these stories, there's often a moment which is to do with the end of naivety. It's the end of naivety, and it's usually as you step into a more mature masculine, something like that happens. So I suppose, because this story is so new to me also, I haven't given it a lot of thought, but that my instinct is he will not be a decent king of that country if he's still caught in the dynamics. I mean, bearing in mind the lad's only 14 years old. What about you, Richard?
You know, something somebody just asked in the chat, and we will go to the chat more in a moment, but something somebody just asked in the chat was, why do people in stories often get some blessing or good thing when they go down to hell or get something from the devil. And to me, this is one of the most, I mean, we talked about it a little bit in our last episode, since we were talking about Orpheus. This is one of the most important things to me, and to me it is part of what makes a fairy tale, right? Is to go into death, go into the land of the dead and come back with a reward in hand. And the fact that the lad, his luck is not just about his, early on the luck is sort of, he gets saved from the river, and he gets saved from the king's various attempts to off him, right? But that eventually his luck becomes something, and I think this is maybe also part of the turn from luck to grace, when it becomes a way of actually healing the land. So you have a corrupt person at the top of this hierarchy, which is this king, and then you have the devil at the bottom, right? And then in the middle you have all the people who, the fountains aren't flowing with wine like they should, and you've got all the kind of the different, the tree, which is the world tree, right? Which is which, like it's something is gnawing at its roots, right? And so part of the hero's journey, if you want to use that phrase, I sort of dislike, to paraphrase Tolkien, I have a cordial dislike of Joseph Campbell. And it's not because I think, it's nothing really to do with him personally. It's the fact that whenever someone discovers Joseph Campbell for the first time, they suddenly have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And they can only ever sort of talk about stories in that way. But I do think, a part of the hero's journey, certainly the masculine hero's journey, is about that, going down all the way to the bottom of the hierarchy to deal with the root, the rot that's set in at the root. And then he's able to come back up. He's able to heal the land. But then the story really would not be complete unless he didn't deal with unless he dealt with the king, which is to put the king where he belongs. What's the king constantly been trying to do? He's been trying to kill him. He's been trying to send him to hell, right? And so now that's the king's job. And so something like that. I don't know. I think the thing that sort of sticks out to me, I guess I would say, would be the turn from luck. It seems to me that the turn from luck to grace is something like when it just goes from being, things happen kind of a nice way for you to, you become like a vector for healing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
I was going to say, forgive me. I was just going to say, Richard, that, the line that occurred to me as you were saying all of that is, he has cast down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. I mean, in some ways, this is a harrowing of hell story, and the casting out of the principalities, the dark powers, so that the true king can be revealed.
I'll tell you a story about Joseph Campbell. I used to lead a conference in Maine, up in on the east coast of the States, and Joseph Campbell came and taught. This was back in the 80s. He taught, and he charged a sobering amount of money that normal hippie teachers didn't charge. And I think they were expecting Campbell probably to give a lecture for this amount of money and maybe a workshop and a Q&A. And they were sort of surprised at when his coordinates came in for when he was arriving and when he was leaving. He was going to be there for a solid 24 hours. And by now, Campbell is a man in his 80s. He's been famous for a very, very long time. He has nothing left to prove. And people were waiting. I mean, Campbell was, as you know, is the rock star of late 20th century mythology. And he turned up, and the day was just like whatever Joseph Campbell wants to do is going to happen. And he started teaching at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And with a couple of breaks in there, he taught on and off for about 22 hours. 22 hours.
Oh, listen.
And people by this on a dazzling array of subjects, because he was presiding over them at the end of his life. So he went from the hermeticism of the tarot through to Tristan and Isolde, through to all sorts of mystery traditions. It went on and on and on and on and on. And he wouldn't eat in the canteen. That's what I remember. And my dear mentor, Robert Bly, took it. He said, no, I have to have a steak. He said, I'll give you another 6 hours, but I have to have a steak and I have to have a good whiskey. So they took him out to Lake Darren-Mascotta and he had a steak and good whiskey. And anyway, he carried on teaching and then caught this very late flight back to New York. And in the car, there was a couple that were driving him. And they said to him, Mr. Campbell, it's been a wonderful day, but there's a lot of people here who are having problems in our relationships. And, this is even in the 80s, this sort of whole notion of polyamory was still surfacing and people were still trying it. And they said, we just don't seem to have good relationships for raising children. And Campbell, from the back of the car, said it's because none of you understand how to carry a sword anymore. And you don't know how to cut decisively when you need to cut. And a blade that wobbles is far, far more dangerous than a blade that cuts. Now, drop me off here, please. Those are my bags. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Got on his plane, disappeared. That's Joseph Campbell. That is another level of discipline, intellectual acumen, the whole game. And I just thought I'd tell you that story because you won't hear it anywhere.
No, it's that's good because it makes me like him a lot more. And I certainly don't feel like I'll ever hold a candle to him, intellectually. I've really got no beef with him. It's just sort of people who, read the hero's journey and then decide, I've got it all figured out. I've got the key. I understand every story now. I've got the key. And then it's sort of like the stories just sort of die and become uninteresting to them.
But can you imagine what my life is like? I've traveled the world for 30 years doing this now, for thousands and thousands of people. And you tell them these great myths and they go, oh yeah, I'm kind of into it. And then you have to go, you can tell they're not really getting it. So you have to go, okay, once upon a time there was a Shire and there was this guy called Sauron. And they go, nom, 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 nom. And that for me, that's my version of the version.
Fair enough.
Of the thing. It's like the great. Those stories are fantastic, and luckily, in my own life, if I really really love something, I don't go near it very often because I don't want to be able to decipher it in a way. I just want to have that. And the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and Tolkien in general. He and Lewis are the great totem energies of my childhood, my family's childhood, my dad especially. But that's my problem often is until I start breaking things into, I think it's the thing that's going to kill Malcolm Guite in the end, if you know Dear Malcolm. Malcolm, far more than any of us, is, he is, it's like he has literally walked out of those stories.
Yeah.
And I was saying to him, I said, if I was, a 19-year-old American living in Idaho and I met you, I'd have a kind of nervous breakdown. I don't know what would happen to me. I'd never leave you alone. I'd just walk around after you like a little duck, But the problem, of course, is love Tolkien, though we do, is to do what you gentlemen do with him, which is also look at what he's pointing towards.
Yeah.
Look at the myths that he is drawing from all of the time.
So this brings me to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and we're not even sort of remotely on script anymore, which is fine. The script was always there as a comfortable lie to make Father Andrew feel better. But
it's a kind of apophatic theological datum just to show us where we're not.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly it.
When I was in seminary, our dogmatics professor, Dr. Harry Busalis, who is a magnificent human, number one, also played a Rickenbacker bass guitar and was always in a part of a band consisting of him and seminarians. During my day, it was Dr. Harry and the Dogmatics. But in any event, he when he introduced the syllabus at the beginning of the year for the class, he would always say, the syllabus is an apophatic object. It's there just to show us where we're not.
So
anyway.
in that spirit, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, And I'm asking because this is something which I am working on in my own life. So I will tell you, audience, the harshest thing that Martin has ever said to me. And we're sitting there. This is at the Symbolic World Summit,
Also known as Peugeot Fest.
Yes, right. 2 Februaries ago, and we're sitting there and we're talking about things, and I said something, and you said something to the effect of, I remember you put your hand on my arm and you said something to the effect of, said, Richard, you're a good preacher, but you're not a storyteller yet. And I think that was, fair and accurate. It's something that, the tendency to want to preach, like even when you tell stories, right? It's very hard to, especially because I was a preacher for, 8 years. And but kind of in that vein, this is something I've been working on, and Martin, I send you occasional little updates as I'm working on these, developing these skills. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, how do you go about beginning to try to find your authentic voice as a storyteller, right? So most of us start out and we just have to write the Tolkien out of ourselves. Right. So it's like the first 100,000, 500,000 words, we're just trying to write the Tolkien out of ourselves. So whether you're doing oral storytelling like you do, or whether we're doing, we're writing, how do we go about kind of finding a voice that's actually authentic to us and also to our own time and place? I mean, I live in North Texas, which is not a land, like in suburbia. And so it's very hard to find, I can't just go sit in a hill fort because there are none here. So. Yeah.
Very, very good questions. Very good questions. The key, let's start with storytelling. The key to storytelling at its most effective, by and large, this is the rule: show, don't tell. You've heard me say that before, I would imagine. Show, don't tell. So if you lean too heavily and you give too many signals to the audience about the allegory that's just underneath the surface, you have already moved into a sort of a preaching mode. I have witnessed countless thousands of sermons in my life, like you guys have. And so I know the tone. I know it when I'm getting the good word laid upon me. And for storytelling, that is a deadening thing. Whenever you learn a story to make a point, you have got the cart and the horse the wrong way round. The story is the thing that is imaginative enough, is hopefully Holy Spirited enough to be leading you always into further discovery. I remember one of our great teachers over here, Metropolitan Anthony, when he was very old, someone said to him of his teacher, the thing about famous about Metropolitan Anthony, they said, if you ever met him or you heard him give a sermon, it was absolutely engrossing, and then you could never remember a single word of what he just said.
Absolutely true. I experienced that in 2001. I went there to his cathedral. I met him. I listened to his. I remember what he said to me personally, but his sermon was engrossing, and I could not even tell you what he talked about.
It's a kind of like Russian magic thing that he had. But this is what he said. He said, I am like a horse. I am like an old horse waking from a dream. What an amazing... A storyteller is an old horse waking from a dream. You see, that's like the Mossy face of Christ thing. Like you don't want to know too much. Well, what is a horse wake? Just let him be an old horse waking from a dream. And so the mistake of which I have made, of sinners I am the first, when it comes to bad storytelling, the mistake I made in the early days was, I became so fizzy with words and poetic speech. I would cram them in at every opportunity. And what happens is you are endlessly drawing attention to yourself, and you're taking it away from the narrative. You're an awful word is showboating. You don't want to showboat. So you have to, most storytellers go through a period where they mistake eloquence for sounding like they've swallowed a thesaurus. And you have to get the thesaurus out. You have to work your way through all the etymologies. You have to do a lot of study for stories, and then be prepared to neglect or just not bring to consciousness most of what you know when you're telling it, because the story. And I don't mean this in an unchristian or pagan sense, but the story does sort of have an agency all of its own. It does want to do stuff that you're sort of privy to. You're not, here's a common metaphor, great storytelling, you're not a lion tamer, you're a lion dancer. You're dancing with the narrative. In my own shambolic way, I just did that with that little fairy tale. I just wandered, it's not, you don't nail the tent down too harshly around the edges, otherwise you yourself will never be surprised. A storyteller who is never surprised has lost any Hermean contact. And when I say Hermean, I mean Hermes. Hermes is the Greek god of the storytellers, and the irony is when we think of a sealed vessel, but actually God of the storytellers, Hermes, he travels to place and he communicates with you, but he can only do it through contact with soul to soul. So people say to me, we live in a Hermean age. The internet is Hermean because it's so Hermean, because it's so much information. But until your soul is moved, Hermes is not present. So as a storyteller, you said an interesting thing earlier on, Richard, about as a storyteller, you have to inhabit every character in the story. Otherwise, there'll be an absence in the telling. So when you get to the baddie, you have to have seen the story through the eyes of Grendel. You have to have seen the story through the eyes of the monster. Otherwise, it's not a holistic telling. It's a moral instruction.
Yeah.
And there's place for moral instruction, but in the kind of world of myth and story, to come in too heavy like that is a gauche move, we would call it. It's gauche. You don't do that. Let the stories lead you. Anyway, I could say more about this for hours, but I'll be quiet.
I want to just put out there that the Beowulf poet himself does this. Most of the Grendel scenes are actually from Grendel's point of view, and there's a fun trick in Old English where whenever Grendel is seeing Beowulf from Grendel's point of view, we use these monster words that normally we would use for Grendel to refer to Beowulf, because Beowulf is a monster to Grendel, right? It's not at all what he's expecting. Yeah. And you can do this without Grendel being, it's not to say they're trying to make Grendel this sort of sympathetic, maybe the monsters, are right all along kind of a thing. Maybe we're the, but you're still able, the poet is able to really inhabit the Grendel's space and Grendel's mother and her sorrow over the death of her son, and the way that all of those things play out in this violent way. So, all right.
I have to ask, though, since it just occurred to me. So, I mean, in the story that you just told us, Dr. Shaw, I was of course very amused at the 80s rock and roller depictions of the evil one. But I mean, does that come out of thinking about, okay, what's it like to be the devil? And how do you even ask that question? I guess maybe I have too much of a preacher. I won't claim to be a theologian, but I do think about theology a lot. What is it like to be the devil? Is the devil that we encounter in that story, I mean, is that truly the devil, or is that the devil of this story?
I would say it's I personally I think there's a world of difference between the trickster figures that you encounter in folktale and fairy tale and the kind of thing that the patristic fathers are talking about. Yeah. I really do. I think it's night and day most of the time. And I also think it's rather unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate phrase of turn, because we've lost, Blake used to say this thing. He said, why is it that the word devil seems to have more energy than the word God? And he kind of has an investigative point. And I think that stories like this, they're absolutely not to do, for me personally, with encounters with evil. They're a bit of a an amalgam. Yeah, what's happened to them, I think, is unfortunate when they're referred to as the devil. Another thing I'd say, this is one of the things that I find Christians struggle with a bit, sometimes with my own work, is that I'll do things that provoke, but then I don't gently lay out my 3-point plan for what it all means. So there's a little bit of spiritual provocation in there. So in other words, in my line of work, there's a real difference between pastoral teaching and prophetic teaching. And pastoral, well, I think we overly fetishize the prophetic. Actually, I think we these prophetic words, but there's a lot of times where the pastoral is called for. I spend a fair amount of my own life with people at the end of their life, or at funerals or that kind of thing, and that is a moment where you draw the tribe in. And you remember the essential values that we all stand for. It's not a moment to be blowing everything open. But one of the things that I do, I have a whole year course called Skinboat. And Skinboat is what I call Christian mythopoetics. So we would look at the story of Samson. We'd look at the story of Joseph Joseph in Egypt is an underworld story. That's my reading of it. And we're trying to do two things. On the one hand, I'm trying, if they're interested, to be around folks that have been in churches to a point where the stories may have become so combed over and calcified. It's a bit like the animals in Narnia, where everything is frozen. And we need a bit of Aslan roar to break the stories open again. But on the other hand, I'm also trying to say to a modern people who live in this a la carte spiritual condition where everything seems available all the time. There's this amazing kayak. You have an ancestral kayak, that has these stories in that are just waiting to be told, and they have an agency and a power. You make come over here. So my world, traditionally for us all as storytellers, we always work on the hinge. Storytellers are characters of the hinge. It's why, to be honest, when politicians are very interested in, what do they call them? Borders. A borders are not the same thing as frontiers. You might have heard me say this before. A frontier is not a border. And stories are frontiers. And in a way, a fairy tale is a frontier between Christian influences and other stuff, and it's all banging around in it. I would have to say, if you're interested, there are certain stories now I will not tell as a Christian.
This is one of the other questions I wanted to ask you. So tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, the oral tradition, real storytellers, like stuff happens in a room when they tell those stories. It impacts you in a way it doesn't when you read a book. And I must say, my particular skill is not really for short stories. I'm a long distance runner. I'm a many days teller. And what I've learned is I can take a kind of imaginative elevator very, very deep down into the psyche. But you have to be able to get at the storyteller's contract is that you could get people out again safely. And if these days I come across stories that have an unredeemable darkness in them, I'm not going to tell those stories. If there isn't a redemptive quality somewhere in a fairy tale, I would suggest you leave that alone. Otherwise, you've just blown it. You've just blown it into the world. You've just animated it. It doesn't mean that stories can't be dark and difficult. Good Lord, you only have to think about Gethsemane. You only have to think about the Passion. I can't even talk about that stuff without weeping uncontrollably. But to be honest, say, for example, Richard, a story we both like, the saga of Hrolf Kraki. There's a few things knocked away in Hrolf Kraki that when I tell them in a room, everything kind of goes weird. So, okay, I can't do that. I can read it, I can narrate it, but when I kind of put my imaginative and physical energy into it, something happens. So certain things that I've walked away from.
Yeah.
So I want to talk for maybe 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 more hours. However, Ancient Faith is a radio station.
We have to pay the sobering amount if we want the 22-hour.
That's right. Right. Listen. I will be more than happy to get you a steak and a whiskey anytime we're anywhere in the same neighborhood. But all right. So I think that just for time's sake, we're going to go to the chat, and then we'll play ourselves out here, because there's another, there's other programming that we have to make way for here. But oh man, there's just so much more I want to say. But let's go, or really ask you and hear you say. But let's go to the chat here, see if there's anything that jumps out at us.
We got one of the first things that was said. Now, this might seem like a sideways question, but I thought it was a good idea. So at the very beginning, Joe, he says he wanted to ask, what are our thoughts about the theories of scholars that Celtic gods were assimilated into the lives of Christian saints? Is there any truth to this? And how should we understand it? Does it affect our readings of these myths? And I think maybe in the context of this conversation, we could make it a little bit more broad and say, in what way do pre-Christian or maybe para-Christian, I don't know, stories feed into Christian storytelling? Like, how does that? I mean, you said that fairy tales are a place where the Christian and the pagan kind of knock around together at the frontier. So maybe talk about that a little bit more. How these things cross over the frontier.
Well, it's interesting, Father. You were talking about saint stories. My friend Paul Kingsnorth has spent quite a lot of time recently arguing the case, and I think convincingly, that Saint Bridget is absolutely not Bridget the goddess, which is taken for most people as, no, it is Bridget the goddess. And most of the early saints in Ireland are an amalgamation of earlier figures. But I wouldn't say that is the case, actually. What you do find, though, is people are people and stories are stories. So they kind of assemble themselves with particular, dare I say it, tropes, particular characteristics, and they burst up. I've always gone with Augustine, I'm afraid, in a very simple way. All truth is God's truth. So I don't get terribly uppity when someone says to me, don't you realize that Yahweh is actually a sky god from... I'm like, bring it on. I find that fascinating. These things are not threatening to me. I'm not interested in a defensive Christianity. We don't need to be defended about this. This should give us more imagination, more freedom, more reality. So whilst I think in some cases those stories are going to bump up against each other, and we know, of course, in Ireland in particular, they had green martyrdom, but they didn't really have red. There wasn't much blood spilled. Christianity arrives as an invitation, not as an imposition. It arrives as a conversation. And it shined, the desert tradition in particular, shined with the Druidic. There's just no doubt about it. And so if I look at both of you, 3 generations before, if you were living in Kerry, I can quite imagine that you would have been hopping around a stone circle and, praising the moon. And then consciousness grows and exfoliates again, and you get it goes on. Anyway, you guys say something.
Martin, another way I've heard you express that about the way that Christianity came to the Celtic peoples was that it came on the tip of a tongue rather than the tip of a spear. And to that front, you won't know this, but there's sort of a running gag here, which is that I wear a plaid shirt very often on the show, which irritates some people, and so sometimes I wear instead a thematic T-shirt. Today I'm doing both things, and I have to say, sadly, for the last time, because I have to match Father Andrew starting next episode. But I do have our Dr. Martin Shaw's. Yes,
unbelievable.
Hold on, I'm gonna step back so you guys can really behold the glory.
I'd say this is like the guys who go to the rock concert wearing the T-shirt from the band.
Yeah, it's
very lovely. It's very touching.
So this is the Dr. Martin Shaw Christian Wetterdale's T-shirt, which, just to put a plug, you can get from the Symbolic World store. But it has this really, really cool logo, really, really cool design by Heather Pollington, which has these 4 different things that have to do with Martin's course that he taught for us, but then it has the Christianity coming on the tip of the tongue. And so anyway,
nice.
It's a great, brilliantly designed T-shirt, and that's what I'm wearing today. So we always have a T-shirt moment on the show. So I just had to point that out.
The image that comes to mind in thinking about the collision of Christian and pagan stories, which, I mean, in a lot of ways, this whole podcast series is that on some level, the Great Tales. But I often think about the Frank's Casket, which is there at the British Museum. And for those listeners that maybe don't know what this is, just type in Frank's Casket on Google and you'll see it. You'll see pictures of it. So, I mean, this is probably a reliquary about yay big. And it's generally believed to have been made in a Northumbrian Christian monastery in the 8th century. And on it are largely a series of pagan carvings of pagan images. So you've got Romulus and Remus suckling at the wolf. You've got, which is the founding myth of Rome. You've got Wayland the Smith, who's one of these Germanic kind of semi-divine smith figures. I mean, if you look up his stories, they're very dark, some of them. Although the way that Wayland shows up in most stories is if there's some kind of fantastic or magical weapon, he's the person said to have made it. He's mentioned in the Beowulf poem. But then, curiously, after all of this pagan imagery, there is this one panel that is the 3 magi offering their gifts to Christ. And I puzzled over this thing for a long time because every bit of writing that I found about this object did not, it was just attempting to say this is what's on it. But there was very little sense of attempting to interpret why would these things be put together on this object by a monk, most likely? Like, why would he put these pagan things on this very Christian object, alongside especially an image of the 3 magi adoring Christ? But to me, it's that particular Christian image is exactly what's going on. These 3 men, they're not Israelites. They are magi from the East. They are pagans. They are soothsayers, seers, astrologers. There's a tradition that they're kings. And they're offering these gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to Christ. And to me, that's exactly what can happen with the stories from outside of the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
It is they can be offered to Christ. And it's not just an adoption of them. There is an adaptation that also goes along with it. Like gold, frankincense, or myrrh are things that you can use in worship. Right? I mean, that is what's going on there. And so, I mean, I noticed this, Richard and I, we took a pilgrimage to Lithuania, and one of the things, and Lithuania has this long Orthodox history, but always as a minority. And so Orthodoxy was always bumping up against initially paganism and then largely for most of the history, Roman Catholicism. And the way that it bumps is it adopts, but also adapts at the same time. It doesn't just assimilate things into it. There's also this transformation that occurs along the way. So, for instance, you get icons that are completely of Roman Catholic origin, and in some cases only ever lived in Roman Catholic churches, that have a feast day on the Russian Orthodox calendar as one of these things that sort of crosses this border. And I think that Christ is big enough that everything good fits inside him, if I may put it that way.
Yeah.
Everything good fits inside him.
Yeah.
All right, just a couple more things from the chat. This is less a question, more a comment. But Benjamin Feehan says that Bardskull is the only book he's ever read that felt like falling in love. In all the good ways and in all the terrible ones, I think.
There was someone else that said that they read it and had zero. I've never read it, so I don't know anything about it. But someone else said that they read it and they had zero clue of what was happening. They just couldn't figure out what was happening in the book. I know what's the. How would you introduce someone to that book?
The book, first of all, the easiest way, and maybe to get it on Audible, get me reading it to you.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it.
You know,
Absolutely.
just have me, and resistance will be futile fairly quickly once you've got me actually in the room with you. But it's the account. It's the account of what led me to Christ. Bardskull. He is the Bardskull, you know. And it's what led me to Christ. It's the 101 Days in the Wood. And it's, funnily enough, the two examples you've used are probably the typical reactions. One is a kind of good-natured, total befuddlement at what's going on. And for a few of us, it's a very important book for them. And you never know which way it's going to go. And good friends of mine have literally hurled it across the room. But for sure, when when on my 301st birthday I finally die, I'd be very happy for that book to go into the clay with me. That was the one that everything else had been leading to.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
So we'll take one more. Savannah says, she says, what is the best way to introduce, and she puts it twice, small children to fairy tales? How do you keep from telling the story what it is, but explain what's happening to a little child? So how do you keep from turning it into a didactic thing, but still, let them in?
Well, I just think just try telling it as simply as possible in as unadorned a fashion as you can.
That's right.
Once upon a time there was a hut, and in the hut there was a young girl, and she was about to have a baby. Just talk like that, and then maybe a week later, once time and the story is now living in the psyche of your child, you may tell it again and you add a few details, and they'll notice immediately what the new details are. And they'll say, well, Mummy, that wasn't there the last time you told it. And you said, no, well, I had a dream. And in the dream, I saw a few more details about the story. That's what mythologies are generally. They're community dreams. And a dream is a personal mythology. That's kind of what's happening. And although you can't really create new myths, you can create mythic stories, but myths themselves take their generational spanning. However, when you have people in a tribal settled group of about 30, the way a story usually grows and evolves is through people coming back and saying, I dreamt this thing, and there's now a woman. Do you remember that bit where there wasn't a woman and we can't get the women across the lake? Well, I dreamt this woman, and a few of the other women will go, yeah, we definitely dreamt her as well. We dreamt her. And that bit of the chapter, but it grows almost from the ground up. It grows from the ground up. So, that's how I would suggest you just tell the stories. Just quietly just let it live in the room.
Yeah, I've been telling Martin, I've been telling you about some of my efforts to learn and tell the Breton lays to my children. And we don't have the time here to even talk about why I sort of chose those stories. But the short version is that they have to do with my ancestry. These are stories that are in my blood. And they're also sort of, I think, very authentically fairy tales that also interact with the wider tradition in a lot of different ways. But in any case, I'll actually be talking about one of them at the Orthodox Arts Festival on Saturday if you're in Dallas.
It occurs to me, Richard, perhaps you and I will have to go to Brittany someday.
Yeah, absolutely.
To see where these stories were happening.
Yeah, that's definitely in my plans. But in any case, I've been telling the stories, the way that I've been working on them is just starting out with very simple, unadorned tellings and then sort of growing them as I go. And children are amazing for versioning control. So I have lots and lots of children, and many of them are quite young. And even the very young ones remember if I changed something or I got something wrong. I said, well, that's not how you told it last time. So... all right. Well, we could just really go on. But to do that, we're going to need steak, whiskey, and a sobering amount of money. And in the absence of those things, thanks, everyone, for tuning in today for the amazing time of tales and discussion with Dr. Martin Shaw.
And thank you, Dr. Shaw, for coming on. It's been really a joy for me personally.
Oh, thank you, Father. I'm so pleased to hear that. And I just want to encourage you both, just for goodness sake, do keep doing this. It's a surprisingly radical enterprise you're up to. And it's absolutely providential in the Orthodox community that there's a window into this kind of work. And I would imagine, if I put my prophetic head on for a moment, I would imagine in 6 or 7 years, everybody will be claiming to do something like this. But I will draw them back and say, no, I knew these two guys and they were there, so, just take courage. And this is an invitation for everybody that's watching this. This wonderful treasury of story is waiting for you, and it'll be very good for your health.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Martin. I want to encourage everyone to do two things. One is we will get the link. Martin, you'll need to send it to me, and then we'll make sure to update the YouTube description for your appearances in Canada, the Great White North. Additionally, actually, as soon as I'm done recording this podcast, I'm going to go pick up a Canadian friend, mutual friend of the three of ours, and take him to dinner. But
yes.
Mr. Peugeot is in town. But
the world's second greatest Canadian.
Yes, that's right. After William Shatner, I guess.
That's correct. After William Shatner.
All right.
Geddy Lee.
There you go. All right. So we'll put a link for Martin's appearances if people are watching in Canada and they want to go see him in person, which I really recommend getting to do. The other thing is that we will also have a link to Jawbone, which is Martin's YouTube channel. It has been, it was a really difficult Lent for us in a lot of different ways. And listening to your videos as I was driving around trying to deal with various things was just a balm to my soul. So everyone, please check out Jawbone. And then if you were edified by this conversation, please do the usual things: like, subscribe, share, review. This show's home is on YouTube, but we're also on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and just all the other podcasty places.
Yeah, and all you YouTube people out there, make sure you click the little bell when you subscribe so that you can get notified every time we put out a new episode, which is twice a month, which, from what I just heard, you'll be hearing about this 6 or 7 years from now, that this is the OG
That's right.
of analysis and conversation about this stuff.
Can we clip that?
Yes, absolutely.
So I can listen to it in the middle of the night when the self-doubt is shouting in.
And God willing, on our next episode, we're going to be talking about a couple of Lithuanian fairy tales.
Do we know some things about Lithuania, Father Andrew?
We do know some things about Lithuania, Richard. Absolutely.
All right. I want to just say farewell to everyone. Christ is risen. He truly is risen, and he is out and about, as Dr. Shaw said. May you always trace the silhouette of virtue in everything that you read.
And this has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.